The call came in at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning. I was elbow deep in a server migration, noise-canceling headphones on, coffee going cold on my desk. My wife's name lit up my screen, and I answered without thinking because that's what 8 years of marriage does to you. It makes you answer without thinking. Her voice was flat, professional, like she'd rehearsed it in the mirror that morning while I was making her breakfast. The board voted last night. We're restructuring your role. HR will have your personal items boxed by end of day. Don't come back to the office. I pulled one headphone off. What? It's done, Marcus. The paperwork's already filed. You'll find a settlement offer in your email. It's generous. Take it. Then she hung up. I sat there for a moment, holding the phone, staring at the half-finished migration script on my screen. The script I'd written from scratch. For the platform I'd built from scratch. For the company that existed because of me. Hi, my name is Marcus Webb. I'm 31 years old. 3 years ago, I was a freelance developer working out of a one-bedroom apartment in Austin, surviving on instant noodles and the kind of stubborn belief that keeps broke people going when nothing else will. I had one idea, one real idea, and I poured everything I had into it, my savings, my sleep, 2 years of my life I'll never get back. The idea was a logistics automation platform. Not glamorous. Not the kind of thing that gets written up in tech magazines with photos of a founder holding a coffee cup on a rooftop. But it worked. It worked better than anything else on the market, and the reason it worked was because I understood the problem from the inside. I'd spent 3 years before that doing warehouse inventory work to pay off student debt. I knew exactly where the inefficiencies were because I'd lived them. I met my wife at a pitch competition in Dallas. She wasn't a founder. She was an investor, or more accurately, her father was an investor and she managed his portfolio relationships. She was sharp, polished, and she believed in what I was building. At least, I thought she did. We dated for 14 months. Got married quietly, just family, in a backyard in Scottsdale. I thought I was the luckiest man alive. What I didn't fully understand then was the arrangement. Her father, a man who shook hands like he was transferring ownership, put in the seed capital that let me scale, $2 million. In exchange, my wife became co-CEO. Her brother, a man who had never written a line of code or managed a single warehouse operation in his life, became chief operating officer. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself once the company hit certain benchmarks, I could renegotiate. I kept telling myself that for 3 years while I watched them slowly learn the vocabulary of everything I'd built. By the time she called me that Tuesday morning, the platform had 47 enterprise clients and was processing over 900,000 logistics transactions per month. The company was valued at just over $22 million. And I had just been removed from it by the two people who understood at least. I drove home. Not to our house, I drove to my old apartment, the one bedroom I'd never fully let go of because I pay 3 years worth of rent in advance when I find a good deal and the lease wasn't up. Old habit. Turns out, a useful one. I sat at the kitchen table I'd had since college and I opened my laptop. I didn't open the settlement email. Not yet. I opened a folder I'd kept backed up on 3 separate encrypted drives for the past 18 months. A folder my attorney, not our company's attorney, my personal attorney, a woman named Diane who I'd known since law school orientation where we'd both accidentally sat in the wrong classroom had helped me build quietly, carefully, and completely without my wife's knowledge. Because here is what my wife and her brother didn't know. And what her father, for all his handshakes and boardroom experience, had never thought to check. The core of the platform, the actual engine that made it work, the algorithmic routing system I'd spent 14 months building before I ever met my wife, before her father's money, before any of it had been filed as a provisional patent, under my name alone. 11 days before I incorporated the company. 11 days. Her father's investment came 12 days after incorporation, which came 12 days after the patent filing. The platform ran on my IP. Not the company's. Mine. The licensing agreement between my IP and the company had been drafted by Diane and signed during incorporation, buried in a stack of formation documents. My wife had never read closely because she assumed her father's lawyers had reviewed everything. They had reviewed everything except the one document that mattered most, because it had been filed before they were involved. The licensing agreement had a clause. A quiet little clause. The kind that looks like standard boilerplate to anyone not paying attention. It stated that in the event the original licensor was removed from executive leadership without cause or mutual consent, the license would enter a 90-day review period during which the licensor retained the right to renegotiate terms or revoke the license entirely. I had been removed without cause. I had not consented. The 90-day clock had started the moment that phone call ended. I called Diane. She answered on the first ring. I saw the filing, she said. I've been waiting for your call. You want to activate the review? Yes, I said. But not yet. Give me 48 hours. She paused. Marcus. 48 hours, Diane. I need to see how they play it first. She agreed. I ordered a pizza. I hadn't eaten since that morning. The settlement email was waiting when I finally opened it. It was, as my wife had said, generous. $400,000, a non-disparagement agreement, and a formal transfer of my remaining equity stake to the company. Sign here, here, and here. Return by Friday. I read it 3 times. Then I forwarded it to Diane with a single line, "They have no idea." She replied, "Confirmed." Let's stay quiet. I spent the next 48 hours doing something I hadn't done in years. I slept. I went for a run along the greenbelt near my old apartment. I called my mother, who asked why I sounded so calm, and I told her I was fine, which was the truest thing I'd said in months. I ate a real breakfast. I sat on the small porch in the early morning and watched the light come up over the tree line and thought about the fact that for 3 years I had been building something inside a house that was never really mine, and now I was sitting outside in the open air, and it felt like breathing. For the first time. On Thursday evening, Diane filed the review notice with the company's registered agent. Friday morning, my wife called again. This time, her voice wasn't flat. It was tight, like a wire being pulled too hard. What is this document? It's a licensing review notice, I said. Standard process, per the agreement signed at incorporation. Marcus, this is insane. The platform can't operate without the routing system, yes. I know. I built it. There was a long silence. I could hear her breathing. What do you want? She finally said. Nothing from you, I told her. Have your attorney call Diane. I hung up. And I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not triumph. Not anger. Something quieter than both. The feeling of a man who spent 3 years shrinking himself to fit inside someone else's vision and finally remembered his own dimensions. Her father called that afternoon. He was a man who was accustomed to being the largest presence in any room, and I could hear the unfamiliarity of his position in every word he chose. He started with flattery. Told me I was talented, that the company wouldn't be what it was without me. I agreed politely. He moved to negotiation. Offered to reinstate my role with modified responsibilities. I told him I'd have Diane respond. He shifted to pressure. Reminded me that litigation was expensive, that I'd be tying up my own asset in court for years. I told him Diane would be in touch. He ended with something close to a threat. Said I'd never work in this industry again if I burned these bridges. I thanked him for his time and ended the call. I sat back and looked at the ceiling of my old apartment. The water stain above the window that had been there when I moved in. The shelf I'd put up crooked and never fixed. This room where I'd built the first version of the platform on a second-hand laptop with a broken spacebar, copying and pasting spaces one at a time. I thought about the fact that the company, right now, had 47 enterprise clients expecting their systems to function on Monday morning. That the integrations my routing system handled weren't optional. That without a valid license, every one of those client contracts was sitting on top of a legal question that no enterprise client wanted to be near. Her brother called me Saturday. He skipped the flattery entirely. You're being vindictive, he said. This is personal. This is you being emotional because things didn't work out. I thought about the 3 years I'd watched him sit in meetings, nodding at things he didn't understand, then take credit for outcomes he hadn't produced. I thought about the quarterly review 6 months ago where he presented my own product roadmap to investors as his strategic vision, word for word, including a typo I'd left in by accident. I'm not emotional, I said. I'm precise. What does that mean? It means have your attorney call Diane. On Monday morning, Diane and the company's legal team were on a call. I wasn't on it. I didn't need to be. Diane knew what I wanted and what I didn't. My terms were straightforward and they had nothing to do with revenge. I wanted full ownership of my IP formally acknowledged and documented. I wanted my name listed as inventor and sole licensor on all company materials going forward. I wanted a fair market license fee established by an independent third party, paid quarterly. And I wanted a clause ensuring that the platform could never be sold or acquired without my written consent as licensor. I didn't ask to be reinstated. I didn't ask for a seat on the board. I didn't ask for an apology. I asked for what was already mine to be recognized as mine. The negotiation took 11 days. On the 5th day, I heard through Diane that my wife had tried to argue the original licensing agreement was invalid because I had drafted it. On the 6th day, that argument was set aside when Diane produced 3 years of royalty records showing the company had paid under the agreement every quarter without objection, which in contract law is called course of performance, and it means the agreement was acknowledged as valid every single time they paid it. On the 9th day, her brother told the company's attorney that the platform could be rebuilt without my routing system. The company's own technical team, to their credit, was honest. They said rebuilding it would take 18 to 24 months minimum and would likely not perform at the same level. 47 enterprise clients were not going to wait 18 months. On the 11th day, they signed. I was sitting at the kitchen table in my old apartment when Diane sent me the executed agreement. I read it once, top to bottom, the way I read everything. Then I closed the laptop and sat quietly for a few minutes. I didn't call anyone. Didn't post anything. Didn't feel the need to. I thought about my wife. Not with bitterness, or at least not only with bitterness. I thought about the Tuesday mornings we'd had good coffee and talked about where the company was going. The way she used to sit across from me in the early days when there was no money and somehow it hadn't mattered. Something had shifted in her somewhere along the way, or maybe something had been there all along that I'd never wanted to see clearly. I didn't know which, and I wasn't sure it mattered. I thought about her father's handshake, that transfer of ownership handshake. And I understood now that he'd always believed what he was investing in was me, that I was an asset being acquired rather than a person being partnered with, and that his daughter had learned that framing somewhere along the way. What they had never accounted for was the possibility that the asset had its own plans. The divorce was filed 3 weeks later. It was straightforward, which surprised me, and then didn't. She knew the legal landscape now. She knew what I was and was not willing to fight over. We had no children, no shared real estate in my name, no entanglement that couldn't be cleanly separated with enough patience. Our last interaction was in the parking lot of a mediator's office in North Austin. She looked like she hadn't been sleeping. She started to say something that began with, "I didn't think you would actually," and then she stopped herself. "I know," I said. And I meant it. She hadn't thought I would. For 3 years, she'd been so certain of what I was and wasn't capable of that she'd stopped paying attention to what I was actually doing. That's a costly mistake in marriage. It's a catastrophic one in business. I nodded once and got in my car. The license fee started coming in the following quarter. I won't say the number, but it was enough that I didn't need to rush into anything next. Enough that I could sit with the platform I'd built and let it breathe, let it mature, let the quarterly deposits remind me that the value of something isn't determined by who controls it but by what it does. I moved into a house near the Greenbelt. Not a big house. Not a statement house. Just a place with enough room to think and a backyard where I started growing things. Tomatoes, mostly. A fig tree I bought on impulse from a hardware store and wasn't entirely sure I was taking care of correctly. I went back to the warehouse operations research I'd been meaning to do for 2 years. The next version of the platform had been in my head the whole time, expanding quietly in the background while my days were filled with meetings that didn't need me. I started building it. Slowly, no investors, no board, no anything. Just me and a laptop and a good internet connection and the very particular kind of focus that comes from not having to explain yourself to anyone. A former colleague I'd known from my early freelance days reached out about 6 months after the settlement. He'd been following the situation from a distance and he mentioned, carefully, that he'd been in a similar position squeezed out of something he'd built by people who understood its value but not its origins. We had coffee. Then we had more coffee. He had domain expertise I didn't, and I had technical architecture he couldn't build alone. We started talking about what a partnership between two people who'd both been burned might look like if it were designed from the beginning with full transparency, equal footing, and attorneys who read every document before anything was signed. That conversation is still ongoing. I don't know where it leads, but I know the shape I want it to take, and for the first time in a long time I'm building something where I actually know every word of every agreement involved. My mother came to visit in October. She sat in the backyard while I watered the tomatoes and told me I seemed different. Not happy exactly, she said, but more like myself. I thought about that for a while after she said it. I think what she was seeing was the difference between a man who was succeeding inside a life someone else designed and a man who was simply living. Those two things look similar from the outside for a while. Then they don't. The fig tree did not die, which I consider a significant personal achievement. I got a message from my ex-wife's assistant, of all people, in November. Not on behalf of my ex-wife, she made that clear. On her own, she was 26. Had been with the company since the beginning, and she wrote to tell me that the scholarship fund I'd quietly set up through the licensing agreement, a clause that directed 3% of quarterly fees to a workforce development nonprofit I'd partnered with, one that trained warehouse and logistics workers for tech-adjacent roles, had just funded its first cohort. 12 people. Adults who'd spent years doing the same physical work I once did, now being trained for roles that would pay twice as much and break half as hard on their bodies. She just wanted me to know, she said. She thought I might like to hear it. I read that message twice. Then I set my phone down and went outside and sat in the yard in the November cold for a long time. There's a version of this story where I'm the villain. I know that. A man who sat on a legal trap for 18 months while his wife believed they were partners, who never once said out loud that he felt pushed out and undervalued, and slowly erased, who waited until the exact right moment to detonate something he'd been building in secret. I understand how that reads. What I'd say to that version of the story is this: I tried. Not loudly, not dramatically, but I tried. There were conversations over 3 years that I don't need to detail here where I said, clearly and directly, that I needed my contribution to be recognized. Where I said that the way decisions were being made was leaving me out of things I had built. Where I said the words that were supposed to work between partners. They didn't land. Or they landed and were noted and nothing changed, which is a particular kind of loneliness that I'm not sure has a name. So I stopped saying the words and started doing the work I should have done before I ever signed anything without my own attorney in the room. The lesson I take from all of it isn't about revenge. It isn't about winning. It's about a simpler mistake I made at 27 with stars in my eyes and an idea I was too excited about to protect properly. I believed that people who loved me would treat what I built the way I treated it. I believed that trust, once established, didn't need architecture. I was wrong about both of those things, and that wrongness cost me 3 years and a marriage and more hours of sleep than I can calculate. Now I know different. Now I know that the most important conversations aren't the romantic ones or the visionary ones. They're the boring ones, the ones about who owns what and what happens if, the ones that feel unnecessary until they're the only thing that matters. I know how to have those conversations now. I know how to sit across from someone with good intentions and still ask them to sign the thing. I know that being careful isn't the opposite of being trusting. It's actually the highest form of it, because it means you're building something meant to last. Some people learn that lesson from a business school case study. Some from a mentor, some from a book. I learned it in a parking lot, holding a phone after an 11-word phone call, with drywall dust on my jacket. Expensive lesson, but I think I'll keep it.